infinite complacence, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space.
So on this edition of Into the Fray, I welcome back on with me author W.T. Watson, and you will know him quite well. Not only has he been on the main show a few times, but he's also been my guest over on Patreon. He has fiction and nonfiction works, and of course we cover a lot of the nonfiction here on Into the Fray. His books, nonfiction-wise, include Mysteries in the Mist, Phantom Black Dogs, Canadian Monsters and Mysteries. And then on this edition, we are going to be covering, of course, one of my favorite subjects, and that's Sasquatch. And the book, which is a bestseller, by the way, congratulations, WT, in several Amazon categories, is titled Sasquatch Canada, Beyond British Columbia. Now, of course, you're published under Beyond the Fray Publishing, and when we're talking about subtitles, and I think that the subtitle you chose for this book was absolutely perfect, and you say this in the intro in this book, is the fact that when you talk about Bigfoot in Canada, a lot of times it's focused in and around BC. And that is, of course, an extension, if you really want to look at the map, of the Pacific Northwest of Washington State here in the U.S. So it makes sense there's a lot of Bigfoot reports in British Columbia, right? But you do point out that there is plenty of other Bigfoot activity in the whole rest of the country of Canada. And that's what we want to cover, of course, on this show, but that's what is, I mean, the book is rife with encounters from all over the place, and the encounters run the gamut as far as types.
Absolutely. Hi, Shannon. Nice to be back. I chose the Beyond BC thing specifically because, when you read Sasquatch books from the US, if they talk about Canada at all, you're going to be talking about British Columbia, almost invariably. A couple of people, Lauren Coleman and some other people, have mentioned some Sasquatch sightings in places like Ontario, but it's not commonly known that Canada actually is a hot, the entire place is a hot spot for Sasquatch sightings. I found sighting reports in every province in Canada except for Nunavut, which is up above the Arctic Circle, and you may have a couple of reasons why there are no sightings from that area. One is that, again, there's no cover there. It's not very densely forested like a lot of the rest of Canada. And the other is that it's mostly indigenous people up in that area, and the indigenous people in general are reluctant to talk about this topic with people outside of their own culture because they have their particular beliefs about Sasquatch, and unfortunately, people have made fun of those things in the past, and they have been repressed over the course of history. So it's a little more difficult to get those sightings than it is for us to get sightings in other places. But there are, Canada is just rife with Sasquatch, and so I wanted to bring that forward in this book, and I wanted to make sure that we presented a good cross section of sightings from all across the Great White North. And I think I succeeded in doing that. I could have written a book that was probably 2 or 3 times the size of this one. I tried to be selective and prioritize stories and find interesting stories that people would be maybe most interested in reading about. But there's a lot more where that came from, and they're adding to them every week. Just this past week, there's been another YouTube video that's been posted to the web, a Sasquatch sighting up in up in northern Ontario, which looks, I talk about how I don't really want to get into the whole analyzing video thing, but it looks pretty legit. Could be the big guy.
Now, in researching for this, and you pull from many different sources for this book, and I have to applaud you for that, is the fact that there are so many reports out there. Did you come across any that were really close to home for you?
Yeah, actually, in the roadside sightings section of the book, there is a report from a couple of truckers who were driving through St. Catharines, Ontario, which is not far from where I'm sitting right now. I'm in Kitchener. I'm in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. They're driving through St. Catharines, which is a city of 150-some thousand people, and spotted a Sasquatch off the highway down in the St. Catharines area. Large, dark, bipedal, the typical thing where they talk about the stride of the creature and how tall it was and so forth and so on. They were both shocked because they're in a city basically, and they're driving along a busy highway, and they see this thing down in one of the ditches. Now, I talk about how even in my area, wildlife use the streams and other natural features of the land to move around, even in the more civilized areas of Canada. In the time that I've lived here, I've been here for since 2020. In the time that I've lived here, I've seen foxes, I've heard coyotes. I haven't actually seen them, but I've heard them howling at night, and other, there's just all kinds of wildlife that moves in and through these natural features like stream beds and so forth, which is where they saw this creature, including deer. There are plenty of Sasquatch sightings in which, the big man is interested in deer. And there's actually a story we'll probably talk about here in a little bit where the Sasquatch was seen taking a deer. So it's possible that, one of these critters followed prey into a more civilized area. I would think that the hide and seek champion of the world, though, would think a little bit before actually wandering into a city of 150-some thousand people. The other thing, too, is, one of the things that people, particularly in the United States, don't seem to understand about Canada is that we have quite a lot smaller population than the U.S., and that population is mostly concentrated along the U.S. border. I think something like somewhere between 80 and 90% of people in Canada live within 150 miles of the US border. So you have vast swaths of wilderness area all throughout Canada. I can drive 2 hours north of where I'm sitting right now and be in wilderness area. There's a place not far from here, Algonquin Provincial Park, which is, you'll see mentioned several times in the book, sightings all around there. So, I'm not too far from Bigfoot Central.
I did not realize that about the proliferation of people that close to the U.S. border. I had no idea about that. That makes a lot of sense why the big guy likes it up in the Great White North.
Uh-huh. Because he's much less likely to run into people up here, and the people that he's likely to run into are people that might not even talk to you about him. Because there are a lot of Indigenous First Nations people, and I have a couple of sighting reports from those areas. But there are a lot of those folks living, in the more wild areas of Canada, and there are some reports from those places. There was a RCMP report of Bigfoot actually walking into a native village up in forget exactly which area of Canada it was in, doing the typical Sasquatch things, walking around, looking in windows, very blasé about the whole thing. and the people were fairly blasé about having the big guy wandering around in their village. They don't have the same kind of issue with Sasquatch that other folks seem to have. Not that they don't have a lot of respect for these creatures, whatever they are, but they're not as frequently not as terrified by them as other people are. So because they're part of their culture, they and I talk about that a little bit in the book, where the native people up here, whether you're talking about the Pacific Northwest people, where there's very much a whole Sasquatch culture, all the way into the Cree and the Inuk over on the eastern coast of Canada, just accept that this creature is something that's out there. They don't necessarily see it as a flesh and blood primate kind of creature, but they definitely acknowledge that it exists and that it can take solid form. So it's really interesting to study some of their, and I talk a little bit about this in the book. Of course, Kathy Strain's written a whole book about this, but it's very interesting how they view Sasquatch as opposed to how some researchers do.
Well, you brought up Sasquatch taking a deer, and of course the first encounter that I would like to cover is from a soldier on a training mission in 1983, and this occurred in Wainwright, Alberta.
This is one of those incidents where you really have to look at the witness and go, okay. I mean, you just can't ignore this kind of witness. This is an individual who was, before they joined the Canadian Armed Forces, was a bow hunter. So they had spent a lot of time out in the woods. Then they joined the Canadian Forces, were actually part of the Special Operations Group. So I don't know what that would be analogous to in the States, but because they have slightly different mission statements. But I mean, you think of your Special Forces people in the United States are highly respected, and they are accepted. If they tell you they saw something, they saw something. So this fella's a special operator. He was on a training mission in Wainwright, Alberta. He also had I guess, a subspecialty in electronics, and he and his partner were out looking for some piece of electronics that they were supposed to repair. Now, this is back in the good old days before GPS, where you had turn-by-turn GPS and you just kind of follow the instructions from the little computer, right? So they are trying to find this piece of equipment that they're supposed to repair using map coordinates, which anybody who's done orienteering knows that sometimes it can be a little bit, I mean, you can get close to where you need to be, and you can get real close if you're really good at it, but there's always a little margin for error when you're trying to orient using the map and compass. So these guys were driving a camouflage pickup truck. They pulled off to the side of the road. The driver had spread their map across the hood of the car. And this fellow was standing and kind of letting his buddy do his thing, trying to figure out where they were going. He's looking off 20, 30 yards to a break in the forest where they were, because they're in dense woodland. Almost every place in Canada is dense woodland. I mean, all you have to do is walk out the door and you're in dense woodland. And so he's looking off and he sees a deer out in the break, and he's watching this deer and he's thinking, oh wow, that's he's a hunter, and he's thinking to himself, wow, there's things up here I could hunt. And he's about to say something to his partner when he sees movement in the bush. And as he's standing there, in a split second, this creature, which he describes as being built like a linebacker. I mean, he was very impressed with the physicality of this being. Starts off on all fours, charges, comes to two legs, grabs this deer, breaks its neck, slings it over his shoulder, and disappears into the brush in just like a heartbeat. He said it happened so fast he didn't even have a chance to say anything to his partner. So his partner didn't even know this had happened, right? And he's thinking to himself, "Geez, oh, Pete, what was that?" And he's like, "I didn't say anything because I didn't want them throwing me out of the military because I was nuts, right?" But he likened this movement of this creature to a time when he was in Africa and he had watched cheetah hunting gazelle. It moved that fast, and it was into the clearing, had the deer, and out of the clearing before he could even speak. So that, to me, is a really good witness statement, because not only do you have a guy who's trained to observe, but he's telling a story that, again, has cross references to who knows how many witness statements, throughout the United States and probably in Canada as well. So I was very impressed with that particular story, and gave it kind of pride of place in the Alberta section of the book.
Yeah, that one really stood out to me. Not only the fact that who the witness was, but this guy essentially had 3 lightning strikes in one encounter, because first of all, he's seeing a Bigfoot, and to him, he knows it's a Bigfoot. It can't be anything else. Boom, there's lightning strike number 1. Number 2 is he gets to see it running quadrupedally. You don't get a lot of people that get to see that. And then number 3, he gets to watch it acquiring its lunch. So I just, that one really stood out to me big time.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, like you said, there's the lightning strikes, and there's just there's something about the account itself that just feels so real that you're like, yeah, that happened. There's no way that did not happen. So that's probably that, of all the accounts in the book, that one really, really stuck out in my mind too. I was hoping you'd pick that one.
See, great minds think alike then. Because, yeah, that one stood out to me right away. I'm like, oh, that's going on the list right now. Yeah. I wonder how many.
Buddy.
Yeah, I would just wonder how many people that guy told. Because now not only does he have this story, but because of his career and his job position, it adds another wrench in there.
Yeah. I mean, the problem, and this is something that you see over and over and over again, and it doesn't, it's not just Sasquatch. I mean, obviously Sasquatch very popular. There's lots of stuff going on about Sasquatch these days, but in all paranormal encounters, there's always that ridicule factor. Throughout the book, for instance, I tell story after story after story of people who actually said something about their encounter, and people are just like, now you saw a bear. And one of the things that you hear from witnesses over and over and over again is, that wasn't a bear. I know what a bear looks like. I know how a bear moves. This thing didn't look like a bear, and it didn't move like a bear. Bears don't walk around on their hind legs like that. I mean, they can get up on their hind legs, but they don't walk smoothly and efficiently on their hind legs. So you hear this over and over again, but it's so easy for people to just go, yeah, you saw a bear, because particularly up here in Canada, there's bears everywhere. I mean, chances are, if you hang out in the woods long enough, you're going to see a bear. But there's a big difference between a bear and a Bigfoot, and but it's only the people who've actually seen these creatures who seem to get that. So yeah, that's my rant for today.
You're allowed to rant as much as you want. Yeah, and in fact, and just a side note here, talking about picking, that encounter and that story, these that we're going to cover today are just a drop in the bucket of what is in this book. So just so everyone knows that it was a tough choice for these 5 stories. I'll just say that right now. So well done on that one, WT. So
I don't honestly know how many stories there are in the book. I didn't actually count them up, but I know that I have, because I use OneNote to organize my sightings and stuff, my incidents, and start to form chapters and stuff to get organized to put a book together. I've got, I'm going to say easily over 150, 200 stories listed in my research notes. Not all of those made it into the book, but I mean that just gives you an idea. And I'm sure there are others. I was looking primarily for what BFRO and other organizations call Class A sightings, where somebody actually saw something. So that pares things down a little bit. But even then, I got well over 100 sightings out of Canada between books and different sighting databases and so forth. It just gives you an idea how prevalent these creatures are up here.
Now, you brought up the BFRO, and in two more encounters, we're going to cover one that is included in your book from the BFRO, and then the last one we're going to cover is from Alberta Sasquatch. I assume that's their website, right? Now,
yes.
Does Alberta Sasquatch also split things up a little bit like the BFRO, where they have it's a Class A or a Class 1, whatever, and somebody actually saw a Bigfoot?
Yeah. Basically, what they did, instead of saying Class A, Class B, they just put they have a little header, witness sights Sasquatch walking across the street or whatever, which kind of gives you an idea. So there's a little more labor intensive going through their database and looking for visual sightings, but it wasn't hard. You just had to read the headers. So
yeah,
they didn't actually do, I don't think, a classification. Now, I could be wrong. They may have their own way of doing it, but I just went through and looked at the headers in their database and looked at the sightings that were visual sightings.
So this next one comes from John Worm's Strange Creatures Seldom Seen, and this is Carrie's account. This one is pretty fascinating, and it reminds me of other stories that have actually hit the mainstream. I'm sure it did for you as well.
Oh, yeah. And again, I talked about John Worm's book when I was promoting for Canadian Monsters Mysteries back a little while ago. If you're interested in weird things that happen in Canada, this is a book you have to put on your list. He's an author out of Manitoba. I did find out that he is still running around doing his thing. I haven't had any communication with him, but he's still active presence on social media and so forth. So, but that book, there's all kinds of really interesting cryptozoological stuff in it. So if you're interested in the strange things that might be wandering around the wilderness in Canada, it's definitely a book you should read. Worms is unique in that he seems to have had a real into the indigenous community in Manitoba, because almost all of the sightings in that book are from Native people, which is really unusual. In this particular sighting or story actually came to him from a woman named Carrie. If I recall, let's see, Carrie was from the Dauphin Lake Ojibwa Nation. Yeah, Dauphin River, that's right. The incident actually took place in the early 1960s. Carrie was somewhere between 11 and 12. So you got to understand, people in some of these indigenous communities live in pretty primitive circumstances. Some of the First Nations reserves don't even have, like running water. So they actually have to haul water from streams and so forth up to the house. That's not so much the case nowadays, or they're starting to improve things anyway, but it is still true of some communities out in the wilder areas of Canada. In this case, in Carrie's case, she was going down to the river with the buckets to bring water back to the house. And along the way, the berries were in season, and she decided that she was going to go and pick herself some cranberries. Now, Carrie made two mistakes. For all of you people out there who have any experience with search and rescue, she made two mistakes. One, she wandered off the beaten path. She wandered away from an area that she was familiar with. And two, when she realized she was lost, she ran. 11, 12-year-old girl, 11, 12-year-old anybody, it's very understandable that they might panic in that circumstance and do something dumb. And she really did. She ran and ran and ran and ran, and really just in a panic, with her hands in front of her face, trees swiping her in the face and so forth, crying, terrified the entire way. And so you really feel sorry. You feel for her as you read this story, because she obviously was in great straits. Eventually, she ran out of steam and ended up laying down in a mossy area. Tried to sleep, but of course she grew up in that area. She knew what was out in those woods. And there are large, not just the black bears, but there are the larger brown bears out in those woods. And she was terrified that she was going to get eaten by a bear. So she didn't get much sleep. And for the next several days, this pattern kind of repeated itself. She kept moving, she kept running, she kept trying to find the edge of the forest, hoping she could find her way out. And this is the worst thing you can do when you're lost, because if people are looking for you, if you keep moving, it makes you that much harder to find. So, for all of you folks listening out there, please, if you find that you don't know where you are, sit down. I mean, nowadays with the advent of cell phones and these emergency unit things and stuff like that, there are all kinds of ways that you can be found. And even if you aren't trackable by cell phone or whatever, there are volunteers out there that are more than willing to come and look for you, and they will find you, but you have to make it easier for them to find you. So that's my advertisement for search and rescue. I used to be a volunteer doing that stuff, and it's really important that people know that. So Carrie's, she's having a bad time. She's lost. She's wandering aimlessly in the woods. She's getting scratched up and banged up and beat up and bruised. And after several days of this, she is, even though she has thought to stop and eat berries off of bushes, so she's had some sustenance, she's getting weaker, which is typically what happens when this kind of thing happens. It's nighttime, and her worst nightmares is coming true. She hears something heavy moving through the brush. And there's a funny scene in the book where, she basically just says grandfather, which is a term of respect. I know that you're coming to eat me, so please, just eat me head first and get it over. But nothing happens. Whatever this large thing is in the forest doesn't come any closer to her. And, she's very puzzled by this. So she starts talking. And basically, she tells her story. She tells whatever it is in the woods, that she's lost and she's afraid she's never going to see her parents again. And she's terrified. And she's sure that whatever it is going to eat her. She goes on, at length about this for some time. She's speaking in her native tongue, which is Ojibwa. And whatever it is comes out of the woods. And she can't see clearly what she's dealing with, but she suddenly realizes that this might not be a bear. And it's actually close enough for her to touch it. Now, you're thinking to yourself, oh, well, how come she can't tell that she's standing next to a Sasquatch? It's like, it gets really dark in those woods, folks. One of the things that she noted in the story was how dark it was, even during the daytime, under the cover of all these trees. So at night, it's pitch black out there. It's not like she's able to light a fire or anything like that. This thing gets close enough for her to touch, and she lays a hand on it, and she describes it as being like a beaver pelt, which is interesting, because beavers have very thick, luxuriant pelts. They were hunted for fur for a long time, and beaver fur coats were much in demand back in the early 20th century. She touches this thing, and then she takes her hand away. As soon as she takes her hand away, the creature bumps her, and she's like, "Oh, wait a minute! Now it's going to eat me. I'm sure it's going to eat me." But it doesn't. She gets up, she puts her hand back on it, and it starts to move in a particular direction. And every time she takes her hand off this creature and tries to go in another direction, it basically herds her. It'll bump her back in the direction it wants her to go. So if she's walking along with this whatever it is, bumping her to the left, bumping her to the right, getting her to go in a particular direction. And as the sun comes up, she realizes what it is she's following. And of course, she's terrified because, there's this giant, hairy, bipedal creature walking along kind of next to her, guiding her through the forest. And she, of course, knows about these creatures from her culture. And, they have kind of a mixed reputation. If you've ever read Kathy Strain's book on Sasquatch stories in Native culture, they're either forest guardians or they snatch children and eat them. There's this strange dichotomy about how Native people see the Sasquatch. This particular Sasquatch, though, fades off into the woods and peeks at her from behind trees, and eventually they seem to come to some kind of a rapprochement, and the creature continues guiding her out of the woods. Eventually, that's exactly what happens. Is they come to a cut in the forest that she recognizes as a place where the tribe had cut down some trees in order to make an airfield, which is one of the ways that you can get supplies in and out in these really remote regions in Canada. She knows where she is, and she's like, aha, she runs out into the middle of this clearing, and of course the creature fades back into the forest, just disappears completely, right? She runs down this clearing, finds the road, and this older Native person is driving his truck along and picks her up. And she tells him that she's been following this great big bear that walks on two legs and has very long arms. And the grandfather just laughs at her and says, "Oh, you're very blessed to have been guided out of the forest by this creature." And he takes her home because, of course, everybody knows everybody. So he knows exactly who she belongs to. He takes her home. Her parents are a little iffy about believing this story about a Sasquatch guiding her out of the woods, but it's part of their culture. And eventually, and her siblings, of course, give her crap about it. She becomes known as the girl who touched the bear. But eventually, her father tells her a story about how when he was lost in the woods when he was young, one of these creatures had actually supplied him with fish until he could find his way out. So I find it really interesting, like I said, that if you read Kathy Strain's book, there seems to be these two streams of thinking in amongst Native people, where they, on the one hand, see this creature as a threat that actually, kidnaps people out of the village, and in worst case scenarios is actually cannibalistic, right? And on the other hand, there are these guardians of the forest who, if they're treated respectfully, will assist you. So this is definitely one of those stories about a Sasquatch that was willing to assist somebody and save this probably save this little girl's life, because I mean, being lost in the Canadian wilderness, it's only a matter of time before exposure gets you. Even in the summertime, in some areas, it can get pretty cold at night. So I'm sure that this creature probably saved her life.
Yeah, that one immediately reminded me of little Casey in North Carolina, the 3-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
He was missing for 3 days, and it was freezing cold, and he said a bear looked after him, and everyone's
bear
like, well,
took care of him. Yeah,
bear took care of you. Now, he's 3, so maybe he just didn't know what a Bigfoot was or is, and that's all he could think of. But if he made that story up just completely out of thin air, it's kind of strange. Now, he didn't say the bear led him out, so that part is definitely different, because that Sasquatch in Carrie's encounter chose to, as you say, save her life. But it immediately reminded me of Casey's story.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and it's very evident from spending any time doing research in Sasquatch lore that these creatures, for whatever reason, are really curious about us. and they're particularly curious about kids. We'll come across the traverspine gorilla a little later, and he gets himself into trouble peeping into windows, watching kids in cabins. We saw that behavior in that one RCMP story that I was talking about earlier, where the Sasquatch wandered into the village and it was looking in people's windows. And we see that behavior not only with Sasquatch, but also with Dogman, which is really scary.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's scary enough seeing a giant bipedal primate apish type of creature peering in your window. It's another level of scary when something with a dog's head looks in your window and the first thing you think of is werewolf.
Yeah, and then you're like, oh, what window was it looking into? Oh, the second story window that's about 12, 13 feet off the ground. You're like, oh, no.
Yeah. Or 8 feet off the ground or whatever,
yeah.
It's like, holy crap.
Yeah, that's a whole nother level of no thank you. Well, yeah, this next one comes out of the Saskatchewan area, and this is BFRO report 12733.
Yeah, this was, as you said, Saskatchewan, which is not known for lots of cover. A good portion, probably half the province, is prairie, but there is mountains. This particular sighting takes place in an area that's kind of mixed terrain. There's some forest land, there's marshes, there's other terrain, and the individual was out duck hunting. And the really interesting thing about this story is he was duck hunting. He was, going to one of his favorite spots for bagging ducks. I was walking along. The field that he was walking through was freshly cut, and there was a bunch of, plant matter laying around the field. As he's walking along, he sees something white underneath one of these piles of plant material. And when he lifts this plant matter away from what it was he saw, he finds a lump of dead terns. A tern is a type of seabird. Think seagull. It's a kind of a large seagull. And he finds 7 of these things, all dead as a doorstop, and they're packed together in what he described as a big lump. But they didn't seem to show any signs of, external signs of injury. So I wasn't sure why they were dead, but there they were, and they were packed together in a big lump and hidden under a pile of plant matter. So, I mean, he didn't think a whole lot of this. It was kind of unusual, but he wasn't completely freaked out about it or anything like that. He figured that some raccoon had somehow managed to stash these birds for a snack later. So he goes on to his hunting site. He has considerable success. He gets several ducks, but it starts to rain, and he decides that he'd better get out while he can get out. And as it happens, he promptly gets his truck stuck in the mud. So he gets out of the truck, and he's going to go see if he can find help. He's making his way along a road after he followed a trail away from his truck, got himself onto a road. He's walking along. It's raining. His head is down. Well, you can imagine he's not feeling, in charity with the world at that particular time. But as he's walking, he catches a flash of movement in his peripheral vision, and he actually describes the event like this. He says, "I saw something. It didn't seem really tall, but I was a couple of 100 yards away from it. But it was big. I mean, real big. Wide across the shoulders, no neck, just like a big giant head sitting on huge shoulders and short little legs and long arms. It was moving extremely fast, but not running." So this thing was headed down a ditch into a little valley. But what really freaked this fella out was that this being had to have crossed the road in front of him, and he didn't see it initially until it got into his peripheral vision off to the side because his head was down. So he may have walked within feet of the thing and never even known it. When he went back to the area to look around, he finds one of those mystery footprints, right? He's like, he finds a single footprint, just one, which always makes you wonder. It's like, why just one footprint? If, the Sasquatch is as big as it is and it's tromping along in the mud, you'd think it'd leave a whole string of footprints, right? Finds one footprint, 16 inches long, 5 to 6 inches wide. He noted that the creature was dark brownish, reddish color. So the witness puts two and two together and says, geez, I wonder if those terns were actually a food stash, and if the Sasquatch had been coming back to get to pick up its food stash and discovered this interloper wandering around in its area. Now, this story kind of gave me pause for a couple of reasons. One is the weird thing with the terns. That's like, okay, well, how's the Sasquatch bagging birds? Is it ambush predating birds as well? I would think that an animal that big would need something bigger to eat. Maybe it needs to gather a whole bunch of terns to have a meal. The other thing is the single footprint. Like I said, it's like, why just one footprint? We know that there are instances where Sasquatch leave trackways, right? We also know there are instances where Sasquatch leave trackways that disappear in the middle of cornfields. There's something weird about this critter that we'll probably end up talking about later. So we wonder if the Sasquatch was coming back to snag those terns and go off and have a midday meal, or what its motivation was. But again, as so often happens, he sees this thing, it crosses the road, it goes and disappears into the valley away from him. But again, this is not a heavy cover area like you would have up in the boreal forests in northern Ontario and places like that. This is Saskatchewan, and we weren't up in the real heavily wooded areas of Saskatchewan. So there's a video of what might be a Sasquatch that was taken Raven. I'm thinking Raven, Saskatchewan, something like that, where this thing just is walking off the road into, down into a gully that's got some tree cover, but it's surrounded by prairie. It's like, and that makes you pause because, these guys, again, hide and seek champion, you'd think they wouldn't be wandering around in open areas, but then Sasquatches are seen in places like Arizona, which doesn't have a whole lot of cover until you get up into the mountains. So again, made me wonder.
Yeah, and as you say, I'm sitting here reading this and I'm going, well, I would, much like the soldier in the very first encounter that we talked about out of Alberta, he got to see how that Sasquatch procured his lunch. And I'm going, how did this one do it? Did he sneak up on them? Did he throw rocks at them and knock them out or kill them that way? Because we've heard of other stories where these guys seem to have great aim when they need to.
Yeah, the whole rock throwing thing. I did a whole section of the book about the whole rock throwing thing, and we're not. You don't see too many stories where people actually see Sasquatch throwing rocks. I mean, I'm sure somebody somewhere out there has seen them throwing rocks. But again, yeah, how are they bagging these terns? Yeah, I mean, again, this creature seems to be really intelligent. So I don't put it past them to be able to hunt birds. If you're going to hunt birds, why not just take them off into the woods with you? Why leave them in a ball in the middle of a field somewhere? It's just another one of those puzzling things that we run across when we explore the lore of these guys.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe the lump was kept in the marsh, maybe in the watery area to keep them, more refrigerated. I don't know. Yeah, that seems very odd about the placement of the birds.
Yeah, I just thought that was really strange. Unless the other possibility is that, the Sasquatch had other people intruding in the area or something and hid these for later. We tend to assign, our kind of human ideas about this creature's behavior, and we could be completely off base. For all we know, a ball of 7 dead turns is some kind of a ritual sacrifice for Sasquatches or something. I have no idea. We just don't know. That's one of the things that makes this such a fascinating study, is there's such a mystery to it.
That's why they're just so darn fun to talk about. Yeah, up next we've got the traverspine gorilla out of Labrador.
Oh, yes. So let me read you a little quote here that comes out of Elliot Merritt's book, True North. He's talking about the footprint of this creature, which is one of the unusual things about the traverspine gorilla. It says it's a strange looking foot, about 12 inches long, narrow at the heel, and forking in the front into 2 broad, round-ended toes. Sometimes its print was so deep that it looked to weigh 500 pounds. Now, okay, primates don't come with 2 toes. So we know that, we're encountering something unusual here. One of the things that throws primatologists for a loop when they start, if they can be persuaded to look at Sasquatch evidence, is these occasional footprints that come out with toes other than 5. Primates are supposed to have 5 toes. That's the way it works. But we see 6-toed Sasquatch sometimes. We see 3-toed Sasquatch. I think it was the Falk monster that left 3-toed prints. Everybody doesn't dispute that these creatures are actually Sasquatch, or what they call Bigfoot down south, but they can't account for why these creatures are leaving these strange footprints. This critter had some other odd behaviors as well. So this happened in 1913 in a settlement called Traverspine, which is in Labrador. Kind of, you want to talk about the Great White North, we're up in the Great White North there. And the creature, as I said, because of its appearance, came to be known as the traverspine gorilla, because that's what it looked like. It was a strange man-like being, had long dangling arms. One of the witnesses said that it had a crest of white hair on top of its head that reminded her of a Roman centurion's helmet. The white hair gave me pause, because there was also a Sasquatch in northern Ontario that was called Old Yellow Top, for precisely the same reason, because that particular Sasquatch, or its genetic relatives, had sort of blonde hair on the top of their heads. So kind of another little oddity from Canada. But so the story starts in autumn of 1913, and seems to kind of revolve around a family called Michelin, which is probably not how they actually pronounce it. A lot of French speakers up here, so I'm not sure exactly how that would be pronounced in French. But girl was outside in the autumn. She was playing by herself near the settlement, somewhere close to her parents' cabin, and she spies this weird creature in the woods. Again, the long dangling arms, the strange mane of hair that looked like a Roman centurion's helmet. But the weird thing about this is that the witness claimed that the creature grinned at her and made a hand motion like it was trying to draw the girl closer. Well, fortunately, the girl had some sense. She screamed and ran for the cabin. And when people came out to investigate, they found these weird tracks that I was talking about earlier. As so often happens in these stories from the early 1900s, a group of men with rifles went off looking for this thing. They tried to ambush it. They set bear traps for it. And this being, whatever it was more than intelligent enough to avoid their traps and to avoid them. But they did find more tracks in areas throughout the forest where trees had been stripped of bark and logs had been uprooted and so forth. So the gorilla stayed around Traverspine for about 2 winters. And here's another thing about Sasquatches that we see a lot that seems to be a particular thing. They don't like dogs, and dogs don't like them. This particular Sasquatch, if that's what it was, went to the trouble of actually driving some of the local dogs into the river. So and it seemed to take great pleasure in harassing the local canines. And the people in the area were just not happy with this critter because it kept disturbing their dogs. The dogs would be up barking and growling in the night. Of course, you're trying to sleep. Life in those areas would have been really difficult as it was, and not getting any sleep at night didn't make things any easier. So again, the Michelins seemed to be kind of at the epicenter of this whole set of sightings. And the second sighting at this house produced even more fun. Again, we see the window peeping behavior. This creature came and was looking in the window of their cabin. One of the kids spotted it and started screaming. Now, Mom wasn't having this. She just wasn't having this. She grabs her shotgun and heads out the door. And the creature is disappearing into a clump of willow trees. She opens fire on this thing and actually she says that she hit it. She had that meaty thud sound that you get when you actually hit something. And again, we have a scientist who says, I know what this was. A guy named Bruce Wright was talking with Mrs. Michelin many years after the events in 1947. And he told her that he thought that she saw a rare barren ground grizzly bear, and she laughed in his face. And I'd like to read this quote because I just love it. It was no bear. I've killed 12 myself, and I know their tracks well. And I saw enough of this thing to be sure of that. I fired a shotgun at it and heard the shot hit. My little girl was playing behind the house, and she came running in saying that it was chasing her. I grabbed the shotgun, went outside just in time to get a glimpse of it disappearing in the bush. So if a woman who's killed 12 bears tells you that what she was looking at and what she shot at wasn't a bear, guess what? I'm going to believe her. And you can take your scientific materialist self and go somewhere else. There seems to be a little confusion about which sighting was which in this one, but the fact remains that something caused Mrs. Michelin to run out of the house with a shotgun and shoot at this thing. And, she's giving an account of the shooting later on, so she may have gotten her two stories juxtaposed, but regardless. The other interesting thing about this is that, again, they tried to track this thing. And again, it's leaving these weird footprints, even though they were described as barefoot and ape-like. They would sometimes find, you hear Sasquatch researchers now talk about nests. They find these nests in the forest, right? They're talking about finding nests here as they followed the tracks. And whatever this thing was, it went over obstructions that humans would have to go around. So it was big, whatever it was. So, again, there was something strange stalking the people of Traverspine. Now, there's some argument about whether it was a Sasquatch or not, and I'm perfectly willing to hear other people's thoughts on that. I think you had a guest on not too long ago who had another theory about the Traverspine gorilla, but I can't remember what it was. But I almost put this sighting in the weird stuff category because of the strange behavior of the Sasquatch when it encountered this girl. It acted almost like a human trying to lure somebody into the woods, which is not behavior we typically see from Sasquatch that people see, up in the Pacific Northwest or whatever. I was kind of reminded of the whole Osman story where, Bigfoot just basically gathers somebody up and walks away with them. And I wonder if that's not what this creature was trying to do for whatever reason. And the other thing that made this one a strange one was the two-toed tracks. Again, primates don't make two-toed tracks. That's not a thing. So we don't know what this was exactly. The descriptions seem to indicate that it was a Sasquatch, but there's some doubt about that.
Well, and this, as you say earlier, is us, or me, I should say, probably trying to anthropomorphize Bigfoot. But the other thing that stuck out was, besides it trying to beckon to her with its hand and fingers, it also seemed to smile. Of course, I've heard Will Jevning a million times talk about the whole gorilla lip flip, and that's actually a sign of aggression. But when you have made, if this was a Sasquatch, we're assuming they're very smart, could it have learned that a smile is supposed to be something good and positive, and it paired it and married it with this, what seems to me to be a very nefarious action in trying to beckon this girl out into the woods? That's the first thing that came to my mind, but of course I could be way off.
Yeah, I mean, again, like I mentioned previously, in native lore, they're kind of divided half and half about, this creature being a forest protector or tribal protector, or stealing women and children from camps. So, this particular Sasquatch, who knows? The thing that we do know, if this creature is a flesh and blood animal, it's awfully, awfully good at not being found. And that in and of itself indicates a really high level of intelligence. So we don't know what nefarious purpose it might have with, taking a human child into the woods. I don't care to conjecture on that because I have nothing to base a conjecture on. But, it may have learned behaviors that assisted it in doing whatever it was that it wanted to be doing. And that, to me, makes this story superbly creepy.
And by the way, it's like you're supposed to watch out for dads with shotguns. I would watch out for mama in that story, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Mom nailed that critter.
man, I'd feel bad for the girl's first boyfriend when she brings him home. It's like, forget that.
Yeah.
You got to watch out for mom over here.
Yeah.
Now,
beware of mom.
in Sasquatch Canada, WT, you were not afraid to include some encounters that, of course, have a strange element to them. And a lot of times, and I think people are getting more and more comfortable to share these kinds of encounters and sightings, a lot of times you can't get away with talking about Bigfoot without at least mentioning some of the strange things that come along with them. And you weren't afraid to put those in the book. And of course, I wanted to pick one of these kind of stranger ones. And this was procured from Alberta Sasquatch, their website. And this was report number 041.
Yeah. So I have long theorized that Sasquatch is something more than a flesh and blood creature. At least some Sasquatch are. I have a whole conclusion to this book that talks about both and thinking. Yeah, I am entirely comfortable with the idea that there could be an unknown primate wandering the forests of North America. I'm entirely comfortable with that. And there may come a day when somebody brings a body into to the scientists, and this becomes a classified creature, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't explain some of the weird crap that happens around these creatures. So at least some of these sightings have an element of high strangeness to them that we just can't explain. And again, I go into considerable theorizing at the end of the book about why that is and what happens and those kinds of things. But the thing I want people to take away from this is you can believe that Sasquatch is a flesh and blood animal, and you can believe that there's something weird going on. And those two beliefs do not have to oppose each other. We don't have to engage in either or thinking, because this is just too strange a topic to try to draw like a set conclusion. We just don't know at this point in time, and we may never know. That's why it's a mystery. I like mysteries. They keep life interesting. So in this particular case, we're talking August of 1972. This witness was a child at the time. And this is another one of those things that one of my pet peeves is that people have this tendency to discard childhood observations. Oh, well, it's just a kid. I think that's just grossly unfair. particularly in a situation where a child has had an observation of something, of Sasquatch or any of the paranormal things that has been traumatizing, the child needs to be believed and worked with, and not told, oh, it was just a dream, or you saw a bear or whatever. It's just so easy for us to fob kids stuff off as, oh, it was just your imagination. Well, maybe it was, but maybe it wasn't. And I really think that children need to get more credit for being able to observe things and report things and tell you what they saw, and for people to be able to believe that. So this incident occurred in Strathcona Island Park in Medicine Hat, Alberta, which is one of the things I love about Canada. Is we got great place names. We've got places like Medicine Hat and Moose Jaw and other really colorfully named places. There's a place in Yukon called Yellowknife. Just love the names up here. And there are a lot of, obviously, indigenous names as well. So this witness and his family were visiting this park, and they were having a family picnic. It was a wonderful, wonderful day. It's August, so it's warm for a change. They'd gone to the river and they were swimming. And about 1:30, the family decided that they were going to go back to the campsite, which is about 150 yards from where they were. And this young witness took off like a bolt into the woods because he wanted to claim the first hot dog. So he was well ahead of the group. As often happens in a Sasquatch sighting, his first indication that there was something strange going on was an odor. Down in Florida, they call them skunk apes for a reason. A lot of times, you will find that there is that terrible smell that accompanies a Sasquatch. In this case, the boy described it as like a newly washed dog that had been rolling in garbage for a week. So the witness heard a movement off to his right. He turns and looks, and he sees this large black and red furred back at a range of about 30 feet. So he was close to this thing. He wasn't quite sure what he was looking at, but whatever it was squatting, and he could see its buttocks just like inches from the ground. We were talking about, or I guess we weren't talking about, but I might mention that berries play a big role in Sasquatch sightings up here. There are probably, I would venture to say, 3 or 4 sightings in the book that have to do with berries, and that's my estimation. In this case, the being that this boy was looking at was hunched over a bush of Saskatoon berries, and was squatting down and having a snack. I mean, just very obviously, whatever this thing was, it was huge, because the witness says that even though it was squatting, it was still easily 5 feet high and probably 4 feet across. And again, had the cone-shaped head, that sat directly on its shoulders. Very, very classic Sasquatch, right? So, you're listening to this and you're thinking to yourself, oh, well, this is like any other Sasquatch report we've heard. The kid is wandering through the forest and he sees this thing and it's eating berries. So what? Then the story takes a turn for the weird. The witness thinks to himself, what am I looking at? And in his mind, he hears, you don't see me, I'm not here. The witness is like, well, wait a minute. What am I looking at? And again, he hears in his mind, you don't see me, I'm not here. So this happens twice. And then the Sasquatch starts to make this weird chattering noise. When I heard this description, I immediately thought of the samurai chatter in the Sierra Sounds. And the witness suddenly is just filled with the thought that he needs to leave, that he needs to get out of there right away. So he takes off, runs back to the campsite, and the Sasquatch goes off in the opposite direction, headed for a nearby creek. So, the boy's like, okay, well, I just encountered this really weird thing in the woods, and his family's, they pull out the standard, the good old standard, you saw a bear. He's like, no, this didn't look like any bear I'd ever seen before. And so then the family starts joking with him and telling him that he'd seen a Sasquatch. He didn't even know what a Sasquatch was. Okay. So this was not, some kid who'd been watching In Search of or whatever and decided that he saw a Sasquatch. He had no idea what a Sasquatch was until somebody explained it to him. And then he was like, yeah, that must be what I saw. So, a lot of researchers reading that final part where, the creature chatters at him and he flees, he's filled with this thought that he needs to leave. A lot of researchers now would pull out the infrasound explanation. And that may be true. I don't know. But infrasound doesn't explain how this witness received a mind-to-mind transmission from the Sasquatch, and how the Sasquatch told him very specifically, you don't see me, I'm not here. Now, when I think about this, it sounds a whole lot like this Sasquatch was trying to manipulate him psychically. And in fact, you have to wonder if, some of these people who wander into the forest and have missing time aren't actually, not being abducted by aliens, but actually ran into a Sasquatch who actually successfully wiped the memory from their minds. Now, I know I'm getting into lecture there, but when you start to talk about these things and you start to talk about the stranger things, anything's possible, right? So, but in any event, this boy had a direct telepathic communication with this Sasquatch. And that's not something that flesh and blood researchers are going to be able to easily explain.
That does make me wonder, like you said, is this a failed attempt at a memory wipe situation? Because why just say that very specific sentence if he then just ran to camp and said, oh, I saw this weird thing?
And the other thing that makes me wonder is how many people have actually seen these creatures and then just not remembered it. They wandered into the woods, they saw a Sasquatch, the Sasquatch just looked at them and said, you don't see me, I'm not here, and they don't even remember it. It's like, I talk about a roadside sighting where a young man is sitting in the back of his family's Cadillac, and this again happened in Ontario. And they're driving along, and he happens to look out the back window of the car and sees a Sasquatch cross the road behind them. Now, we see a lot of roadside sightings where the Sasquatch crosses in front of the car. How many sightings get missed because the Sasquatch waited a couple of minutes to let the car pass before it crossed the road? I mean, it makes you wonder just how often these creatures come into contact with human beings and humans don't even recognize it. They don't see them. They don't see them for whatever reason, either because, the Sasquatch has an ability to manipulate people's minds or because they're just sneaky. So it's just lots of fun to think about.
Talk about a bummer, though, at least for me. Not that I would remember if it wiped my memory. I'm just saying that, you finally get to see a Sasquatch and it just goes, I wasn't here, you didn't see me, and then you don't remember. What a bummer.
Yeah, he uses the Jedi mind trick on you and you forget.
What a punk.
That would suck.
I'd be like, listen, I'll bring you back a hot dog. Just let me remember you, okay?
Yeah. I'm more than willing to leave offerings in the woods if you will just let me see you.
Yeah, I'd be like, listen, I'll fashion a fishing line if I have to, if you prefer fish, but let me go find something at camp. I'm sure there's something you would really, really enjoy.
Well, yeah. I'm sure hot dogs probably would work.
Yeah. Well, WT, this book is, we could probably actually do like 4 episodes, and there's still plenty to read, but I just really encourage anybody interested in Bigfoot to go and get this book. It really does run the gamut with all kinds of sightings, and of course it's split up into sections of Canada, and that way you guys can do your own research too if you would so choose. But I thank you so much for coming on, and I want you to let everybody know, of course, before we go, where to find you and your books.
Thank you. And again, I should mention the book is kind of set up in a sort of an unusual way. It's set up by provinces, so you can look up your province and see a selection of Sasquatch incidents or episodes in your province. Then I did a whole section on roadside sightings, and then I got into the stranger stuff. So there's a little bit of everything for everybody there. A lot of the sightings, like I said, come across as, it's like you saw a bear in the woods, except it was a Sasquatch. Some of the sightings are pretty strange. There's sightings in the book about Sasquatches that walk off into the woods and disappear. So, as I said, what I wanted to get across in this book was that I'm perfectly okay with there being a undiscovered North American primate, but I think there's some high strangeness attached to this critter too, and that needs to be paid attention to as well. For those that are interested, the book is available on Amazon, both as as Kindle or as an ebook and as a paperback. I am on Facebook, W.T. Watson author page. I'm on Twitter. I think it's W.T. Watson 2. If I remember right. And then I'm on Instagram as Curunir, Curunir 60. So I'm always happy to hear from people. I'm starting to occasionally hear from folks who want to tell me stories, which makes me happy too. And that's about that.
Heck yeah, let's go book 2, Sasquatch Canada.
Well, like I said, I have a huge database or set of notes, stories that didn't make it into this book. So that's entirely possible. And as I said, too, there continue to be Sasquatch encounters up here, as I'm sitting here, probably. This is a land of vast forest and, habitat that's just rife for large mammals. So, if Sasquatch is a flesh and blood creature, it would be happily coexisting alongside brown bears, black bears, and cougars, and all kinds of other large predators. So there's certainly the biodiversity up here to be able to support a species like that.
Yes, more people having experiences that, at least for the most part, in most cases, we're very jealous of, right, WT?
Yeah, I had wished that I had more of an opportunity to go out and sit in the woods while I was writing this. I'm working full time and doing all that kind of stuff, so I don't have as much time to get out as I'd like. But between writing books and working full time, that's about all I got time for.
Yeah, it sure sneaks up on you, that's for sure. Well, thanks again, WT. Sasquatch Canada, beyond British Columbia. Go get it, guys. And WT, can't wait to have you on next time. Can't wait for the next book.
Okay, thank you.